And so like all of these things together could lead to, anywhere between 10 and 20, 25% fewer calories consumed in the United States, or, 10 to 20% lower environmental footprint. And so that's just huge. It's hard to imagine any single intervention that people would fight for that could have a bigger impact on calories consumed. And that just means, that impacts what farmers produce, that impacts, global supply chains and the rest of the world.
Hello, food chain. This is Sharon Cittone, and I'm a food tech junkie and innovation nerd who loves a good story. This podcast combines all of my favorite vices into a deep dive about the problems our food system faces and the visionary people working on solutions. This week, we're joined by Jack Bobo, expert, author, and futurist, to explore the trends, actions, and possibilities shaping the future of food. We'll discuss how we make choices about what we eat and tackle big challenges facing our global food systems. Jack is the newly appointed executive director of UCLA's Rothman Family Institute for Food Studies, where he'll bring his extensive experience to Los Angeles. He is also the author of Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices, and has been recognized by Scientific American as one of the 100 most influential people in biotech. This is going to be an interesting one. Are you ready? Here we go. Hey, Jack, how are you?
It's good. It's good to be here.
I'm excited to have you. We're going to touch upon some pretty, I think, important points, very relevant points that are going on today in our food system transformation bit and journey that we're on. So before we get started, for our audience, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and how did you end up doing what you're doing today?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's great to be here. So my name is Jack Bobo. I'm the director of the Food Systems Institute at the University of Nottingham in the UK. But a little my background, I spent 13 years with the U.S. Department of State doing global food policy, so covered food policy in Africa, Asia, Europe during my time. Then went and spent a few years in industry as head of communication and global policy for a biotechnology company, also working in the food and ag space. And then spent a few years as a food futurist, working with food tech startups, big food brands, helping them think about what does the future of food look like, where are consumer trends and attitudes going, and how do we get ahead of those trends so we don't get run over by them. And then right before joining the university, I was with the Nature Conservancy, which is the world's largest conservation organization, as the director of global food and water policy, which brings me to today.
Yeah, you have quite an impressive background and tons of experience. And I think we could ask you questions for days. And it would all be super interesting. But one thing that has been pounding the news, I would say, for the past year at least, are GLP-1 drugs. And, sometimes I often think about, we created a food system that created a lot of obesity, and how are then these drugs and the food industry, which seems to be really picking up on this trend, dealing with that. So could you start just by explaining what GLP-1 drugs are and why are they becoming such a significant point of discussion among those concerned with diet, nutrition, and the food industry at large?
So I'll give a basic overview. I'm not a doctor, certainly no medical advice here. But these are the new class of weight loss drugs that seem to really have an impact. And so many people that are taking these products, which were originally for dealing with diabetes, but a side effect was that people tended to lose weight. And so now it's really taken over. More people are using these products for their weight loss potential as opposed to just to deal with diabetes. And they can lead people to lose 10, 20% or more of their body weight from the use of these products. And it's not just that they lead to people losing weight, it's that they completely shift how you think about and how you approach food. So completely different basket of goods. You're not interested in snacking. You're interested in eating healthier foods, whole foods. And so there's a wide range of impacts in terms of, how you relate to food and your food behavior. But I also think it's really important, I think these are going to completely redraw the landscape when it comes to food and agriculture as well. But I'm not an advocate that this is the way we should be doing it. As you know, I wrote a book in 2021, Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices, which is all about consumer psychology and behavioral science. And so, sort of, I'm on the record as saying what we really need to do is redesign our food landscape so that it simply delivers healthy outcomes the way it did, maybe in the 1960s or something like that, where people weren't thinking constantly about food. They weren't counting calories. They weren't doing any of those things. The food environment simply, delivered a lack of obesity. But I do think that, all of the companies in the food space need to have these products on their radar, and that, they're going to impact almost every company.
Yeah, and we see a lot of several big companies are already integrating the GLP-1 products within their products. So before that, let's really dive into what you just said, right? So, the impact that you see GLP-1 drugs have on food production, but also anything from agricultural practices to supply chains, which is very interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think at the moment, the companies that are thinking most about this are sort of the snack companies. They're looking down the road, and some estimates say that 13% of all Americans could be on these products by 2030. I think the potential market is just vastly bigger than that. So that's almost like the bottom number is 13%, which is huge. But, for the sort of the direct impact, I think it's snacking companies are just wondering, it's like, okay, what are we going to do if people, don't want their potato chips or crisps or whatever it might be? They're not doing as much snacking. And so, they're looking at, maybe changing package sizes. Maybe people won't want a larger bag, but maybe they'll be okay with a smaller bag. Um, but, but you sort of see three major impacts on the food companies themselves. You've got one group of companies that are saying, okay, people are taking these products and there are a lot of side effects. And so for many people, it could be nausea, it could be vomiting, it could be, some relatively serious side effects that impact people's lives. Are there food products we could produce that would make it easier for people to take these products? So an entire product, range is going to be coming out of products just to allow people to maintain use of the drugs. Then you've got this second group of companies that are saying, okay, well, we don't want people to be taking these drugs forever. So we need to develop a line of products that help them maintain the weight loss and as sort of an off ramp for the drugs. And so that's an entirely new class of products that are coming to market as well. And then the third group is there are companies that are out there that saying, well, now that we understand how these products impact the body and cause it, the GLP-1 to be produced, are there natural products that could have exactly that same impact? So instead of taking a drug, maybe you just eat a different types of food and you get, maybe not as dramatic, but a similar effect. And so you've got, all that going on. So you've got companies that are reformulating, companies that are shifting their basket of goods, and then companies that are trying to develop new products for this demographic. And so, all of that is, impact. Those are all the direct impacts. But I think there are a lot of second and third order impacts that people should be thinking about too.
Yeah. Or do you think there's going to be any environmental considerations here?
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's getting back to, if it's just 13%, that would already have an impact sort of on the food that we do. But I think, it's worth keeping in mind that the potential market is just vastly bigger.
Yes.
So as you know, 42% of Americans are obese, 75% are overweight or obese. And so, that's potentially 75% of all Americans that might be interested in accessing these products if they were accessible and affordable, which they are not right now.
Yeah.
So there are shortages of the products and, they're just enormously expensive. But we have a huge number of products in the pipeline. So, 5 years from now, it's not going to be a few products, it's going to be, close to, 5 to 10 products that are on the market and just more after that. And so it's easy to imagine the number being way above that. And so, I like to sort of do a thought experiment about, well, if people had access to this and if 50% of Americans would probably get them if they could, what would be the implications of something like that? And I think it's worth doing because, there are a lot of things we say, well, what if all Americans, stopped eating meat or, what if we were all vegan? Well, you can do that research and say, okay, well, we'd have a lower environmental impact, but it's hard to imagine how that future happens.
Mhm.
Whereas when we talk about these products, I mean, people are fighting to get them. They're spending tens of thousands of dollars out of their own pocket to be able to access these. And so, that's just a very different world. And so, the reduction in calories could be, 20% reduction in calories consumed. So just the back of the envelope, if you had 50% of Americans consuming 20% fewer calories, that's 10% fewer calories just across the board for the United States. But, we also know that if somebody's taking these drugs, everybody in the household is now exposed to a different basket of goods because, whoever's doing the shopping is buying those products. And, there are fewer snacks in the home, there are more healthy foods in the home. And so everybody kind of gets exposed to that, including kids, right? And so children may not be taking these products, but, now maybe they're having healthier food and, that's going to lead people to have healthier diets when they grow up. And then you can think about food waste. Well, if you buy 20% less food, you aren't going to have, you'll have 20% less food waste. And so, that's another 5 or, 7% reduction in calories that need to be produced because if nobody wastes them, nobody needs to buy them. And if they don't buy them, you don't need to produce them. Or you can make them available, in other parts of the world. And then the last thing I would say is that there's also a shift in the types of protein that people want. So people tend to consume the same amount of protein, but they tend to eat less beef and more poultry and other proteins. And so again, that's going to have a lower environmental impact. And so like all of these things together could lead to, anywhere between 10 and 20, 25% fewer calories consumed in the United States or, 10 to 20% lower environmental footprint. And so that's just huge. I mean, it's hard to imagine any single intervention that people would fight for that could have a bigger impact on calories consumed. And that just means, that impacts what farmers produce, that impacts, global supply chains. And the rest of the world is in the same place as the United States. They're just sort of 10 to 20 years behind in terms of sort of the obesity rates. Every country in the world is following that same trajectory, though. Just to put that in context, before 1975, there wasn't a single country in the world that had an obesity rate above 15%. And today, basically no country in the world has an obesity rate below 15%, with a few exceptions like Sudan. And so, I think that sort of this is a global phenomenon. So companies should not be thinking of these products as like a drug and what impact will this drug have on me. They should be thinking of it in the same way they think about climate change, that this is a force and this force is going to sweep across the food industry and everybody needs to be thinking about it. These products are going to have as big an impact as climate change for many companies in the next 5 years.
And that is pretty staggering, especially if you look back and for people like ourselves that knew more than me because you've been at it longer, but that we've been talking about the food system transformation. How do we impact food waste? How do we impact climate change? And then a drug comes along and here you go. It could have this massive impact a lot faster, obviously. And I wanted to drill into a point because it's not talked about. And I mean, it's exactly what you mentioned, right? Not just the obesity, but malnutrition in general it's the leading cause of death globally. Heart disease or liver disease or diabetes or whatnot, like chronic illnesses. And so the psychology, I guess, of losing weight is toppling this. which to me is a crazy phenomenon. Um, and could you, and I don't even know, like in a way we sort of discussed it, but what do you think about that in terms of like just human behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I think it for many people they describe it as, transformative. Like instead of stressing about food every day, it just goes away and the behaviors are changing and they're just their relationship to food changes. And, that's for many people, it's just transformative. But also just, keeping in mind, we haven't really talked about sort of the impact on society in terms of cost. The U.S. spends $1 trillion a year on diet-related diseases, and globally, according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, it's 10 to 12 trillion dollars. And
Yeah.
so, this is going to have a dramatic impact on our healthcare system as well. Um, assuming we're not spending another $10 trillion on the drugs, and I do think that cost will come down dramatically. But, I think that that's really important because that is one of the things I talk about in my book that, it's really important that we bring the joy back to our food. I think more and more people are stressing about food, and that stress is making it hard, undermining the relationship with food. And none of those are a good thing.
Yeah.
And so if this gives us a little bit of breathing room to maybe make some of those system changes that will then sort of embed some of these changes in terms of healthier eating and snacking and other things, then, maybe we can imagine a time, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, well, we don't actually need the drugs because we've embedded those good behaviors. And the younger people that are growing up have just grown up in a better food environment themselves. And so everything gets easier. So, I can certainly imagine a world in which, we're not all taking the drugs in 20 years because we've been able to uh, sort of solidify those changes in behavior.
Yeah, it is. There are also, I guess, ethical or social concerns, though, that need addressing, right? Like, what are the lines between the pharmaceutical and food production is just going to be a blur?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And, I don't know that we know the answers to that, but the current system is a disaster when it comes to health and nutrition anyway. Just again, the obesity rates and all of those things. People are spending billions of dollars on diet products that just don't work. And, that's unfair to people as well. And sort of our relationship to food, is not uh, appropriate and something that we need to change. And so, we definitely don't want to sort of switch one problem for another problem.
Yeah.
And, we need to keep in mind, the very serious side effects from these products as well, the terms of, people losing muscle mass and all sorts of things. And so, there are a lot of health challenges that all need to be addressed. And again, that's part of why I'm not advocating that anybody use these products. I'm mostly interested in ensuring that we anticipate some of the impacts so that we don't, the pendulum tends to swing. It's like, we look for a silver bullet and then we get the silver bullet, and the silver bullet seems to comes with a lot of unintended consequences we didn't expect. And then, we swing back and we see this a little bit like, alternative proteins were going to save the world. And then, they're a total failure. And it's like, well, they were never going to save the world and they're not a total failure. And, the truth is often somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. And I totally agree. I think also us humans have been extremely good. If there's one thing we're great at is creating solutions that then have a shitload of consequences. But we just don't
Absolutely.
anticipate them. So then you just mentioned alt protein, and then we can go into the sort of climate aspect of it all. Let's dive into that. I guess a little bit. Just overall, can you outline the current dynamics between livestock and the alternative protein sectors? Where does transition competition most prominently arise? And although
Yeah, and I mean,
I
your your listeners probably understand the challenges of our current food system. 40% of all land on Earth is devoted to agriculture. The amount of cropland the size of South America, the amount of pasture land the size of Africa. 70% of all fresh water, a third of all greenhouse gases come either directly or indirectly, and so there's an enormous impact, from our food system. I also think, though, it's worth keeping in mind that part of the reason that we have such a big impact is because population is growing and we're trying to meet the needs of those people. And, if we were farming today with 1960s technologies, we would actually need to cut down another billion hectares of forest to produce the food we do. And so food and innovation have played an enormous role in limiting the expansion of agriculture. And, it's dramatically reduced global hunger. Today, 10% of all the people on the planet go to bed hungry. That's totally unacceptable in this world today. But 60 years ago, 30% of all the people on the planet would have been going to bed hungry. Childhood mortality is at the lowest point in all of human history. And so in many ways, I like to think of it as that in terms of agriculture, things are not bad and getting worse. They're good and getting better, but not fast enough. And so we need to find ways of sort of accelerating the progress. We want to get our 2070 goals by 2050 or 2050 goals by 2030. So I think, that context is really important to understand that, our food system isn't really broken, because if it was broken, you could look back and say, well, it wasn't broken 10 years ago, or it wasn't broken 50 years ago. And I just don't know any time when, you could say that. So, when you think, though, about the livestock sector and alternative protein, I think there feels like there's a lot of conflict today. One sector is denigrating or trying to undermine the other, and they feel like they're a threat to their very existence. And I think that's really unfortunate, because we're going to go from 8 billion people today to 9.5 billion people by 2050. We're going to need 25 to 50% more protein. So there's a huge growth that will happen, needs to happen, in order to improve the nutritional health of, all of the people, that the 800 million people that are going to bed hungry today, as well as that, 1.5 billion people that are coming. So there's this huge market opportunity completely separate from the, reducing production of one or the other today. And I see that as that huge opportunity to bring those two sectors together. Instead of thinking about it as, they're competing for market share, instead, if you look towards the future and you sort of say, well, let's imagine 2050, how do we get there and produce the protein we need? And I see sort of three scenarios. And in scenario one, I call livestock wins. So let's say we get to 2050, we've met all of our protein needs by expanding animal agriculture. Scenario two, alternative proteins win. We meet our future protein needs by expanding alternative proteins. And then scenario three, livestock goes bust. We actually produce 25% less animal protein in 2050. Well, I often ask farmers and dairy producers, like, which future do you guys want? And they all raise their hand. They say, I want scenario one, livestock wins. And then I say, well, okay, well, let's think about, what does that future look like? We add 20 billion animals to the planet. We cut down 10% of our forest. People don't like you, and you don't make more money.
Yep.
Because if demand increases and supply increases, your income has to be flat, right? And so, and all of those negative environmental consequences happen. In scenario two, we don't cut down a forest. We don't add all of those animals. And so demand for real meat increases, but supply is flat. So you have to be making more money in that scenario. And we don't have the environmental consequences of the additional production. And so people actually like you.
Yep.
And then in scenario three, well, if we reduce production in the least productive countries on the planet, and that's not the UK, that's not North America, that's not Europe, well, now they have to be making 4 or 5 times more money. We take 25% of production out, which means that frees up 60% of that pasture land, because that's how unproductive the least productive is. And all of a sudden they have an ultra premium product that people love. And so then when I ask the audience, it's like, well, now what do you think? You can get 95% of dairy and beef producers going from saying, I want the future in which livestock wins, to saying, you know what? that may not be the future that's best for me. And for me, this is just really important because we need to be able to articulate a future, a vision of a future that people want to live in, you know, where people are thriving and the world is a better place. And too often, people are, approaching this from a doom and gloom. If you don't do this, things are going to go bad. And I think instead of asking us to sacrifice for our future, we need to be talking about how do we embrace our future.
And I completely agree. And we have discussed this in the past. There is, I think, massive opportunities for farmers if they embrace the alternative protein industry to diversify their production. If I look, I live in Italy now, in this country, although nobody talks about it, import 40% of your meat. Well, instead of importing that 40% of your meat that goes to maybe the McDonald's, why don't you just create alternative pathways to create that 40%? That's more money in your pocket. And so that common ground, right, does exist, but then it's a rhetoric that has divided these two industries out of fear. And it seems like it's a common thread nowadays in the past 15 years, 10 years at least, where it's doom and gloom, as you said, right? And fear and division instead of looking for, joy, you said, and pathways that actually could be built upon. But to do all of this, I mean, policy plays a massive role, right? What role does at least policy play in facilitating and sort of encouraging a collaboration between these two sort of sectors? And what do we need to do?
Yeah, I think, policy can either serve to help bring people together or it can further divide society, just like communication can bring people together or further divide. And I think we've seen a bit of both. There are places where, policy has brought different groups together and made things easier and created an environment conducive to new innovation. And there are places, and Italy is one of them, that have, used policy to kind of further drive a wedge between different parts of society. And I think that's partially because they can't imagine a future in which everybody is successful, or that there's something in it by, getting people riled up, whether it's somebody's political base or something else. And so I think, I guess I would start with just the language we use. And unfortunately, the companies in the sectors themselves are creating a lot of that rhetoric. I worked with dozens of alternative protein companies, and many of them are the founders of those companies sort of have a moral and ethical view that has, driven them to create these new products. And so they want to talk about that. And, normally I tell them that most people won't buy their products because they believe what they believe. They will buy them in spite of it. And so you really need to get your moral view out of the way in order to have people enjoy your product. And so it's actually just not in their interest, because if you ask them, do you want to sell your product to vegans and vegetarians, or do you want to sell it to everybody? Everybody says they want to sell it to everybody, and then they communicate in a way that offends everything, that everybody else. And so when the food company or when the livestock companies hear, oh, their mission is to put me out of business, even though it's not going to happen, they still are afraid it could happen.
Of course.
If somebody says, I'm trying to put you out of business, well, maybe I need to put you out of business first. And so you end up with that tension back and forth, which is part of the reason why I think, taking that longer term consideration of the challenge helps you to be in a different mindset. And, some people say, well, of course they're going to fight because they're competing. It's like, well, you don't see that between beef and pork and poultry. The thing that's had the biggest impact on beef consumption in America, over the last 50 years is just the rise of poultry consumption. And yet, they know they're a competitor, but there's no anger there. I mean, there's no, trying to consistently undermine the competition by putting into place policies that make their lives harder. And so that's, but currently if the plant-based, is rhetoric has, drives the livestock to then try to undermine the ultra-processed nature of their products. And what we really end up with is consumers being more confused and more scared about their food system. And that's not helping any of us. People should feel, have more confidence in our food, not less. And that gets translated, though, in that policy conversation because government sees different constituencies and then they have to decide which constituency do I want to support and then put into place policies that then undermine the other one. Uh, you know, so, governments could have leadership and they could create a vision that others could get behind, or they can just reflect back, the problems that they see. And that's almost always the easier thing to do than try to provide leadership because people will sometimes be unhappy if you don't say exactly what they want you to say. But I do think that, this is one of those occasions where governments need to step up more and help people to understand like what future, could be best for society.
Yeah. And especially, I mean, we see the difference, the stark difference, I would say, between the countries you mentioned, like the US, Europe, UK, and countries like Singapore or in the Middle East, right? Like where there's a need for food security, where they don't have the big lobbies for beef and poultry and so forth. They don't have an issue with it. They're like, welcome it. They're like, okay, yay, I don't have to import all my food. And I think then you're absolutely right. We have to create a language that works because at the end of the day, it is like that. It could be beneficial to everybody and not be born out of, let's say, fear. But because of sort of these policy frameworks and just the food system, like the food industry in general is different than, pretty much any other industry, also in terms of the regulatory frameworks, right? We're not selling a car. We're not even selling aspirin. We're selling different foods. And each country has sort of their own little pathways. What changes do you see in these frameworks that might be necessary to support both the livestock and alternative protein sectors fairly and effectively?
Yeah. So, when it comes to innovation in food, it's tough. I always say, people love innovation almost as much as they despise change.
Right.
And there, there's no place we despise change more than in the food we eat.
Yes.
Because food is what brings us together with friends and family. And, if you mess with my food, you're messing with my family and people don't like that. But if we don't change how we produce food, everything will change. And so we need to think about how do we communicate in a way that gets people excited about food innovation in the same way they're excited about, the latest smartphone technology. And so, that requires a mindset shift as well. So we need to think about food differently. I do think that, there are opportunities for that. And it's important though, because, the innovation only happens if you have transparent, predictable, and science-based regulations and, people have trust in that system.
Yeah.
Science tells us what we can do, but it's ultimately the public that tells us what we should do. And so if we don't find ways of communicating it so that people not only accept new innovation, but demand it, then, we could end up with lots of products sitting on the shelf that we never get to use. And so understanding, though, consumer psychology is just an important part of this. We often think, that, well, just to give an example, I mean, I often hear that big food companies can't innovate, because all the innovation seems to be coming from these smaller startups. And, if you ask why, people will often say, well, big food companies, they're large, they're slow, they're risk averse, and they're indecisive. So there are all these reasons that keep them from being innovative. And I think those things can be true, but I think that's not getting at the heart of the problem. And so I like to give an example. A year before Oatly came to the United States, Quaker Oats came out with Quaker Oat beverage. Put all this money into developing the product. People loved it. Huge investment in marketing, and it was a total failure. And, and if you wonder why, though, we're probably all familiar with the law of diffusion of innovation, like the innovator, the early adopter, the early majority, and things like that. Well, innovators are the people who try new products, And, you can imagine the innovator walking into the grocery store, seeing Quaker oat beverage on the shelf and thinking, ugh, can you imagine a more boring product?
Yeah.
Because innovators never buy Quaker oat products. A year later, same guy walks into the grocery store, sees Oatly on the shelf, and he's like, mind blown. They're making milk from oats. Because he wants it to come from a startup, right? He wants it to come from that edgy new brand. And so the people who love Quaker Oats don't buy new stuff, right?
Yeah.
Until it's been proven in the market by other people. They sit on the sidelines because they're concerned about how far their dollar goes. They want to make sure their kids are going to like it. There are lots of reasons why they're not early adopters. And that's really a big part of the problem, is that even when innovation does come from big food companies, that's often not what people want. And so we need, if you're a big food company and if you have innovations, sometimes you have to sell them as not being innovative. So, because you need to be authentic to your brand.
Yeah.
What do people want from you and what do people expect from you? And so, for Coca-Cola, nobody wants innovation from Coca-Cola, which is why New Coke failed. It's a company with 100 years of experience of bringing amazing new flavors to my family. Well, that's innovation described differently, but it needs to be authentic. It needs to bring with it that sense of nostalgia that is, part of the Coca-Cola brand. Even when it's new, it needs to feel authentic.
Yeah. And you sort of tapped into my next question, which was sort of about behavioral change, right? But in behavioral change, there's like behavioral science and whether it applies to all protein or GLP-1 drugs. I mean, just pretty much anything related to food system, food waste, whatever, has a huge impact. How do you look at that? And what do you think maybe we in sort of this industry, but also the agri-food industry at large should be doing more?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of little things happening. If you go into a restaurant today, people are redesigning menus in order to make healthier food products or more plant-based products more prominent on the menu. Placement and positioning. You'll see less vegan options on there, even if there are more vegan options on there, because it won't say that it's a vegan option, uh, or vegetarian, because, the four cheese ravioli is vegetarian, but that's just what it's supposed to be, right? So I mean, it's just a good product, and so or a good dish. And you see a lot of application of this through sort of the naming of things. Instead of, the black bean soup, it's the Cuban black bean soup, and so we're understanding, instead of describing something as a healthy choice, we want it to sound amazing. Because, if it's like, oh, it's the low fat black bean soup, that sounds like it's going to taste awful. And the reality is that we actually probably won't like it, because it's interesting when it comes to consumer psychology. If we think something is true, we actually experience it that way.
Yeah.
And one of the examples is when Campbell's Soup came out with its low sodium soup. They knew it through taste tests that people just could not tell the difference. But when they put low sodium on the can, people reported not liking it. And it's not that they're lying. I mean, if they tasted it, they probably, if you'd put them in an MRI and done a brain scan, they would not have been, their brain would not have lit up as if they were really enjoying it. So their experience was impacted by their expectation. And this is part of the challenge that we have in the entire food system. Like if I eat a Weight Watchers meal that has absolutely a sufficient number of calories, I will be hungry 2 hours later because my brain thinks I didn't get enough food. Or, we divide our food in half and, because it's more than enough to eat and, we leave half the food on the plate. Well, our brain thinks we didn't finish our meal. So again, we're hungry sooner, even if we've had sufficient calories. And so it's often our brain, is leading us to make bad decisions, or it's good value. Eating 2 meals for the price of one is terrible value. Getting 2 meals for the price of one is great deal, but you got to take one home, right? So understanding all of that, And you see this with a lot of the alternative protein companies that they don't understand some of these issues. So a lot of the plant-based companies have been saying for years that as soon as their product is cheaper than traditional hamburger, they'll win the war.
Mm.
And I don't think they understand psychology, and I don't think they understand economics. Because when it comes, which may be a little brutal, but when it comes to psychology, nobody wants cheap food. We want quality food at affordable prices. They think it's the same, but it's not. They should never use the word cheap. An example would be like Godiva chocolate. Okay, it's 50 cents for a piece of chocolate. Anybody can afford it, but they will never call it cheap.
Yep.
It's an affordable luxury. And if I'm a plant-based company and I'm trying to call my product cheap when it's more expensive, that's not a good proposition. You're using the language of cheapness, which is associating your product with cheapness when it's not cheap. I mean, isn't the goal to make it less expensive and maintain your premium? I mean, wouldn't that
Yes.
be a great world to live in? But then from the economic side, well, beef or hamburger is kind of a byproduct of steak. Like as long as there's the same amount of steak in the world, there will always be the same amount of hamburger in the world because it's a byproduct. And so do you really want to be in a race to the bottom with a byproduct? The beef companies, they'll give away hamburger before they'll pay to send it to a landfill. And so again, you need to think through like your marketing and your positioning and we're going to put beef out of business or it's unethical, all of those things. Well, the people you want to sell your product to don't think that. And so, people have to decide. It's like, well, they say all these things I don't agree with, maybe I just don't like that brand. And so, again, it makes it harder for people to appreciate their products. So I think there's a lot that these companies that are trying to disrupt the system, and there are a lot of reasons to do that, but you need to also understand the system.
Yeah, I definitely think that you made some extremely good points there. Which is funny how we, to impact costs, penalize ourselves. I mean, look, we all know that good food is more expensive. So why the hell do you want to call it cheap?
Yeah.
Just makes very little sense. So,
Well, so yeah, and I'll just give you like one more example of like companies that are doing it wrong and doing it right when it comes to alternative proteins. And there are a couple of companies that are in the power bar space for insect protein. And one of the companies has a little illustration of a cricket on their packaging, so you know that you're eating a cricket when you eat it. And, that's because, they're excited about the power of insect protein in order to make the world a better place. They love their technology. And then there's another company that, is, a jungle protein bar with, insect powered in very small letters that you can find if you look for it. They're not hiding it. It's on front of package, but they're allowing the consumer to forget that they're eating insects and focus on a super protein or whatever they want in order. So, we want our indulgences to be indulgent. Like we don't read nutrition panels of unhealthy food because we don't want to like it less. We don't want to give ourselves a reason not to buy it. And so, we need to understand that, innovators will buy the cricket bar because it says it's a cricket bar and because everybody will know I'm eating crickets. But the rest of us are a little bit more reluctant to tell the world we're doing it or to do it ourselves. And so if you want to reach the early majority, you need to think about not just who do I need to be as a company today to entice the innovator, but who do I need to be in order to scale and reach the early majority? Because you don't want to change your brand at that moment. You need to be authentic. Who you are today should be who you are when you scale. And so, anticipating these shifts in relationship to consumers is important.
yeah, it's very true. I mean, it seems a lot of companies just speak to an audience of peers, right? People that think exactly like they do, but the world is a much more diverse place made of people like my mother, who, that if me and at home, I say, hey, would you eat a cricket bar? She'd be like, are you crazy? Never. You know, it's like, I'm not eating roaches. But that's a lot of people. But all of this, I mean, that we need to get to talk about climate before I let you go. Because obviously we've seen a rise and now it seems a slight stalling of climate tech. When we talk about our food system, obviously we know major contributor to climate. So there's a lot of talk about net zero. So just to clarify for us, or can you describe how net zero targets might inadvertently lead to the offshoring of emissions, which I don't think we talk a lot about.
Yeah, so I think many of your listeners are probably familiar with sort of the net zero obligations of countries under, the climate convention that, we're trying to reduce our emissions, and many countries have goals and obligations. And so one of the problems, though, with the current net zero system is that if you don't produce food in a country, then you don't have any food emissions to report. and that's a terrible idea because obviously you're still eating food. And the countries you import from may or may not be part of the convention. And so what we don't want to do is we don't want to shift all of that production to places, one, that aren't part of the convention, but two, probably aren't as efficient at producing those products. And we're having that conversation here in the UK. There are parts of the UK, like Wales, that have been advocating for tree planting programs on farmland. And, it's not surprising that farmers don't want to plant trees on their good farmland. And their argument tends to be, I'll make less money and I'll produce less food, and those are bad things. But the Welsh government is saying, well, we need to meet our net zero obligations. And so they're kind of talking past each other. The things that matter to the farmer are not the reason that the government's doing it. I mean, they're not trying to undermine their income. They're not trying to reduce production. They're just trying to meet their goal, their obligations. And so what we need to do, though, is we need to have a conversation where we're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
And so when I engage with farmers or the Welsh government, my first question is always, well, if you plant trees and if you produce less food and if you import more food, does that increase or decrease global emissions? And the answer is they have no idea because nobody's ever done the math. And I think that it's not necessarily a good idea to put into place policies that are going to shift these things around and not know if you're making the world a better or worse place. Because, I mean, the whole point of net zero is not to shift production, it's to reduce emissions, right?
Yeah.
And so now all of a sudden, if they say, I don't know the answer to that question, then we're talking about the same thing. It's like, well, we need to understand that, because if it turns out that offshoring production increases global emissions, instead of planting trees, you should be investing in innovation to reduce the emissions from the stuff you produce yourself. And so understanding the answer to that question helps government to decide where to put their money and where to place their bets. And so we need to sort of recognize that there are these trade-offs. Often today, people are saying, well, we should have more agroecology and more regenerative farming because we need to reduce our emissions. And that's true, but it's only true if we're not increasing global emissions by shifting production other places. Obviously, a huge part of agriculture's emission footprint is from deforestation, and that deforestation is because of pressure from other places that are asking Indonesia or Brazil or others for their products.
Yeah.
So if we can reduce that demand, we can reduce that deforestation.
Yeah. Which is obviously a huge issue. Could you tell us what is the role and I guess the effectiveness then of the carbon broader adjustment mechanism in addressing these challenges as well?
So Europe is, one of the first to start discussing a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And so there are a few products that are going to be coming into force in January. Agriculture is not one of them, though fertilizer is, so that when a country imports something, it could be steel, could be fertilizer, then what they do is they adjust they add a tax based on the carbon emissions of the imported product versus if they had produced it themselves. So what that does is that it means that if it comes from a place that has higher emissions, then it gets taxed. And, if it comes from a place with lower emissions, then, I'm not quite sure if they get a credit or it comes in with a lower tariff or something like that. But the idea is that a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, can help to adjust for, that pushing emissions from one place to another. And so I think that this is not only needed in agriculture, but it's absolutely essential because we just can't figure out whether to produce more or to import more without understanding its impact on the global system. Now, this is an enormously complicated thing, so I'm not saying that, it can happen tomorrow, but, countries should know what their emissions are from a sector. I mean, they're actually obligated to provide that information anyway. And things like the European deforestation legislation, in some ways, carbon border would be less complicated because when it comes to deforestation, you not only need to know like where it came from, but you need to know like where in that country it came from. Like you need to be able to track that beef to that ranch to deforested land. Whereas with a carbon border adjustment, you might just say, well, all beef coming from Brazil has this emission characteristic. It's the average for Brazil. And then that would put a lot more pressure on Brazil to bring down its emissions and eliminate deforestation everywhere in order to bring down its average. And it's not to punish producers in Brazil. The reality is that 95% of producers in Brazil are hurt because of deforestation too.
Yeah.
They're all competing with this, illegally produced beef and soy. And so it's hurting them. How do we, get them to be part of the community that's pushing to end deforestation? Whereas right now they feel like they don't really have any stake in it. And so how do we, make them part of the conversation?
Again, a theme that seems to go around, unfortunately. I mean, obviously, as you touched upon, international cooperation is just required. And also possibly, technology. I mean, how does innovation and technological advancements ensure the more accurate tackling, measurement, and reduction of these offshore emissions?
And I think there are a lot of ways. It could start with satellites being able to track deforestation, to be able to track the movement of animals. At some point that we can also use tracking on the animals themselves. There's no reason we can't have ear tags on every animal that's produced, and it does. It's a very small cost, but that cost actually matters. When I was at the Nature Conservancy, we did the math, and it is a number that matters to producers. But that traceability provides a lot of the information that we need, and we also have blockchain, we have new AI and machine learning, we have AI to help with early warning systems for disease outbreaks, and that could happen sort of at the population scale, but here at the university, we're using it in poultry production to create early warning systems. It could be used in cultivated meat to anticipate, pathogens getting into systems before they ruin an entire lot. And so I think, innovation is touching every piece of the food supply chain. And I think that pace is accelerating, which is going to make things complicated in the short term. But I think it's going to create huge opportunities in the longer term.
Yeah. All right. Conscious of time, I would have again talked to you for hours. I have 1.5 last questions. One, I asked everybody that comes on this podcast, if I gave you a magic wand and you could change one thing, what would that be? And the second is, how do you envision like in just a few sentences, our future of food in, let's say, 100 years?
So first question for me, my magic wand would just be that we all have a shared vision of what the future of food should be. Because I think if we did that, we would come together to solve it. And, you've probably heard me say many times, we often are focused on the near term. And, after 2050, population growth slows dramatically. And so the challenges we have are not challenge or food forever. It's really to get to 2050 without screwing things up. And so, what we need to do is like every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the world. Every day after 2050, it will get easier to feed the world if we haven't screwed things up. And so, I would just say that, we need to just keep that in mind, that the next 25 years are not just the most important 25 years there have ever been in the 10,000-year history of agriculture. And they are, but they're also the most important 25 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture.
Which is crazy.
And so if we can get everybody aligned around that idea, then I think we can easily solve these problems. Agriculture in 100 years is easy because of that population demographic challenge. The question is just, do we get to 2100 or, 2125 and, we've cut down 90% of our forests that, may never recover, or by 2050, we figured things out and we've dramatically increased all of those things because everything has got easier for the last 75 years since we crossed that threshold. And, I don't know which future it's going to be yet, but, I am optimistic that things are not bad and getting worse. They're good and getting better, but not fast enough. And so what I want to do is help to figure out how do we accelerate the pace of innovation and the pace of getting to that better future.
Jack, as always, thank you so much for this inspiring conversation.
Thank you. It's always great to talk to you.
Same. Want to deep dive into food innovation? Subscribe to the Food Tech Junkies series. Tune in and listen to the industry's champions, whose mission is to reinvent our future by collaborating and disrupting the status quo as a way to rebalance our planet and our daily lives. For more great food and ag tech content, visit our website at www.edibleplanetVentures.com, and don't forget to follow us on social media.